Hello viewers, and welcome to a brand new TV series, The Blast from the Past. On today's episode, we will be looking into the life of Herbert Hoover and the crash of 1929. We will take you back in time to relive past events in American history. We hope you enjoy today's episode of The Blast from the Past. This television series is hosted by Gaurav Agarwal, Utkarsh Marshall, Sriram Srinivasan, and Nishant Yadula. CNN presents Herbert Hoover and the Crash.
We begin our journey into the life of Herbert Hoover and the stock market crash on March 4, 1929. A popular Republican, Herbert Hoover won the presidential election in 1928, leading him to become the 31st President of the United States. However, who was Herbert Hoover and what led him to obtain this prestigious spot in his career?
Herbert Hoover was born in 1874 on August 10th. He was born in Iowa. Hoover went to college in 1891 to Stanford during its inaugural year. Hoover claimed to be the first student in Stanford. Hoover married his Stanford sweetheart Lou Henry in 1899. The couple produced two children, Herbert Charles Hoover in 1903 and Allen Henry Hoover in 1907. Hoover began to gain recognition outside of his successful business with his humanitarian efforts. Hoover helped return 120,000 Americans home from Europe with his outbreak of World War I in August of 1914. To accomplish this, Hoover helped lead over 500 volunteers to distribute food, clothing, steamship tickets, and money. Also during World War I, when Belgium faced a food crisis, Hoover worked with the Belgian leaders to feed the entire nation for the entire war.
These acts made him an international hero, and as a result, he was appointed to the head of the U.S. Food Administration, a position he had been after for a long period of time. He advocated many programs to save food for soldiers, for example Meatless Mondays and Wheatless Wednesdays.
Herbert Hoover was offered to join the Democratic Party. However, he refused because he had been a Republican before the war. He announced he would run for the presidency and put his name on the California ballot for the primary election in 1920. He narrowly lost, yet he fully supported the presidential Republican nominee, Warren G. Harding. When Harding became president, he rewarded Hoover with a job, and as a result, Herbert Hoover became the next Secretary of Commerce. Hoover expanded the position and helped mold it into the cabinet position it is today.
Herbert Hoover won the Republican nomination in the 1928 election. He was aided by his running mate, Senator Charles Curtis of Kansas. Curtis would run as Hoover's vice president. Hoover campaigned against the governor of New York, Democrat Alfred E. Smith. The two candidates had very similar interests until it came to the sale of liquor and beer. Smith fought against the prohibition of alcohol, while Hoover found it to be noble. However, he didn't find it to be permanent. This opinion gave Hoover an edge because while many Catholics supported Smith for his ideas, other religions favored Hoover. Due to several factors, Hoover won the vote in a landslide and became the next President of the United States. One of Hoover's main points as a president was his associationalism, which was his idea that businesses would work in association with the government, leading to a healthy relationship between government and big businesses. On March 4, 1929, Herbert Hoover was inaugurated into office. Here we can see him in his car, traveling towards his inauguration. Hoover was loved by the public because of his immigration policies, isolationism views, his pro-business ideas, and his neutral views towards prohibition. Later in that day, he gave his inaugural address, in which he proclaimed the coming of a new day, bright with hope. On this day, Herbert Hoover became the 31st President of the United States.
Hoover started his presidency with a burst of energy. He helped to place 2 million acres of land in the hands of the National Park Service. Hoover also looked at child welfare in the White House Conference on the Health and the Protection of Children in July of 1929, which proved to be very useful to social workers. He also confronted the issue of the federal government's judiciary system, which went under investigation. Two main issues confronted by Hoover were the economically weak agriculture sector and tariffs.
Agriculture was weak in the early 20th century due to a massive overproduction of products, severely lowering profit margins and causing huge surpluses. Hoover tackled the economically weak agriculture by creating the Federal Farm Loan, a government group that would loan money to farmers in hopes that they would limit production and prosper. This group was given a $500 million annual budget.
To bring about tariff reform, Hoover decided to keep tariffs on agricultural products to protect farmers. However, he wished to lower tariffs for other markets. When northern manufacturers protested, Hoover decided to create a tariff commission which would be able to raise or lower tariffs. However, the bid fell apart, so the tariff reform came to a halt. When it came to foreign policy, Hoover did very little. He sent his Secretary of State to attempt to limit the navies of Japan and Britain, which worked out in the favor of the U.S. There was also a World Disarmament Conference that tried to lower the amount of weapons. However, the convention fell apart.
In addition, similar to the Roosevelt corollary, Hoover emphasized a good neighbor policy with Central America and South America. To complete this objective, Hoover removed troops from several countries occupied by U.S. troops.
In 1931, Japan invaded a province of China called Manchuria. That November, the League of Nations demanded Japan to return the territory. However, Japan refused to do so. The Stimson Doctrine, passed by the U.S. government, stated that the U.S. would not recognize any territorial gains made by Japan in China. However, the assault on China from Japan continued, which resulted in the attack on Shanghai. The attack was eventually halted, however, not due to U.S. influence.
Herbert Hoover also faced many domestic problems within the United States. A massive problem Hoover faced in his presidency was the Great Depression, a complete collapse of the U.S. economy. There is no one reason why the Great Depression came about, but there are several events that may have led to the collapse of the U.S. economy. One of the problems was that the agricultural section, mentioned beforehand, was overproducing crops. Due to the heavy need for food in World War I, farmers brought land and machinery. After the war, these weren't needed, causing a drop in food prices and profits. Also, factories had high profit margins and productivity. However, they chose to keep wages stagnant and low. All of the profits were then placed into the stock market or often get-rich-quick schemes, rather than putting the profits into other factories which would have increased profits and jobs. Employees were laid off to gain higher profits, and these employees could not buy as many products from these factories.
Also, on the international scale, there was an economic slowdown. Germany was forced to pay Britain and France for damages. However, it did not have the funds to do so, so it borrowed money from the banks of the United States. In addition, both France and Britain owed money to the U.S. All of these transactions were based on a fragile American economy.
Lastly, Americans were attempting to use the stock market to get profits. 2 million Americans were invested in stock. With the volatile stock market, there was no long-term security of profits. Many people lost their life savings and began living a more impoverished life. Some investors bought stocks on margin, which was borrowing money to buy stocks, which would then be sold for profit so that the investor could repay the bank and could pocket the profit.
In 1929, the economy began to slow. Less consumers were purchasing goods, unemployment rates were high, and interest rates were high. The stock market began to tumble as investors rapidly tried to sell their stocks. On October 24th, also known as Black Thursday, 12.9 million shares were sold in a huge panic. 5 days later, on October 29th, 16 million shares were sold. This day was known as Black Tuesday. This market fall continued for the years to follow, wiping out millions of investors who had invested on margin, meaning that they bought stocks with borrowed money. The stock market crash of 1929, while it was not the cause, signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, one of the worst economic collapses in U.S. history. From 1929 to 1939, millions of Americans were unemployed and most of the U.S. banks had failed.
As a result of consumer weakness and inconfidence, factories began to have their products pile up, slowing production. Because production was slower and profits were much lower, factories began to lay off workers, causing unemployment to skyrocket. Many Americans had to use credit to purchase things necessary for survival, leading many of them into huge amounts of debt.
The gold standard was strictly adhered to in the United States, despite the overwhelming depression. By basing the nation's currency off of only gold, not silver, many Americans had even less of a chance of getting out of debt. This strict adherence to the gold standard led to the Depression spreading worldwide, especially into Europe.
President Herbert Hoover and other American leaders assured the American people that the Depression would run its course. However, it only got worse. From 1930 to 1931, unemployment rose 50%, from 4 million to 6 million. In addition, industrial production was under 50% of what it was during the Depression, and soup kitchens and bread lines became a common sight in cities such as New York. Middle-class families, while now homeless, had a very hard time providing for their families. While salaries were low, thankfully the prices of consumer goods were low as well. As a result, the majority middle-class families did not experience too much hardship during the Great Depression. However, farmers were so poverty-stricken from the agricultural depression, coupled with this Great Depression, that they couldn't even afford to harvest their own crops, while people were starving in large cities of the United States.
President Herbert Hoover was known to be a prominent problem solver. However, even he did not know how to tackle the Great Depression. Many bankers explained that the Depression was necessary. It was a part of the economic cycle, and that the Depression would lower inflated prices, allowing for real economic growth to occur. The majority of the American public believed that Hoover was doing nothing to remedy this depression. However, behind the scenes, a lot was going on.
Initially, Hoover sought hundreds of pledges from businesses to keep wages stable. In addition to creating POOR, the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief, which would provide unemployment benefits to those who had lost their jobs, the money would be supplied by donors. Though there were record donations, there still wasn't enough to provide for all the unemployed. However, Hoover remained firm and tried to still collect money for this organization. He also created public works projects to create jobs for the unemployed. Hoover also increased protective tariffs. However, the tariffs had not had an undesired effect. They cut off imports from other nations and exports to other nations, which meant those nations had less money to pay back the U.S. for the war debts. Herbert Hoover's efforts, however, went virtually unnoticed to the American public, causing him to be one of the most hated people in the U.S. within 2 years of his presidency. Protests began as a result of this build-up anger towards the government. When the farmers had their properties foreclosed, bidders in auctions would force the auctioneers to accept only a couple of dollars for the property, so that the property would be returned to its original owner. In addition, several protests took place in various cities, many of them turning into violent battles between the protesters and the police. In the summer of 1932, more than 15,000 World War I veterans joined together to form a group called the Bonus Army. This group demanded the passage of a bill that would authorize the payment of cash bonuses immediately that the veterans had been promised they would be given in 1945. The Bonus Army set a Hooverville across the river from the capital. When the bill was voted down, many left. However, a few thousand stayed to protest. The president set a deadline for their departure, but when it was not followed, Hoover ordered the U.S. Army to evict the World War I veterans. The veterans and their families were chased by men on horseback. They were tear-gassed, and their shacks were lit on fire. The entire nation was shocked that the U.S. Army was attacking its own citizens, while Hoover defended his actions. From the fall of 1930 to the fall of 1932, 4 massive banking panics occurred, forcing banks to liquidate loans in order to pay back investors in cash. These banking panics were the result of bank runs, where an investor loses confidence in the bank and as a result withdraws their money from the bank. When faced with millions of investors, banks did not have enough cash to pay them all back, leading to the banking panics of the fall of 1930, spring of 1931, fall of 1931, and the fall of 1932.
As a result of these banking panics, thousands of banks had closed by 1933. Hoover tried to remedy this by providing banks with loans through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, hoping that these loans would allow the banks to start rehiring and paying back their investors. However, this plan failed, and the banks remained closed.
In the election of 1932, Herbert Hoover ran for re-election as the Republican nominee, while Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president as the Democratic Party candidate. The main topic of the election was the Great Depression, and due to Hoover's lack of action during the Depression, Roosevelt won by a landslide of 42 states to 6.
All of the reporters and staff hope you enjoyed this episode of The Blast from the Past. Tune in next week to witness firsthand the election of 1932, FDR, and the First New Deal. If you have any questions or comments, ask them at cnn.com/theblastfromthepast. From all of us here at CNN, thank you for watching and hope to see you next week.